The year is 1925. All is well at home as you sleep. However, the rain wakes you out of bed. Next to you is a glowing aura of ghastly light coming from your bedside alarm clock, allowing you to see its time properly in the night. Already tired from a long day, you remind yourself that radium dials have become the new craze as you begin to drift back to bed. But little did you know that the thing you bought to tell time is actively taking time away from you, and unfortunately, the lives of many others. This is the true story of the Radium Girls. No discussion about the Radium Girls can be understood without first understanding why radium became such a craze to begin with. It all started with Henri Becquerel, the French physicist who discovered radioactivity in 1896. Becquerel discovered that energy was being deposited by some unseen means from uranium salts onto the surfaces of photographic plates. This energy deposition was achieved even in the absence of light, which led him to conclude that wherever the energy was coming from has to be from the salts themselves. After Becquerel's discovery, a very famous scientist rose to her height named Marie Curie, and it was during her many scientific discoveries that two new elements were discovered by her and her husband Pierre Curie in 1898, polonium and, the subject of this video, radium. It was demonstrated soon after the discovery of radium that it had bizarre-looking and captivating luminescent properties, and that it could kill cancer cells quite easily. Because of these properties, it led to a public frenzy over the material. This ultimately led to a period of time known as the radium fad or the radium craze, which began in 1903 and peaked around the 1910s and 1920s. The element became in high demand for many different uses, ranging from toothpaste all the way to food items. In fact, there were so many products coming out advertised as containing radium that many of them were even fake, and authorities gave disclaimers about fake radium products to consumers. Radium became so popular that in 1915, it was valued at $84,500 per gram. That means, in 2025's terms, it would be worth $2,675,546.09 per gram. Some notable examples of the kinds of products spiked with radium were Dormand, a radioactive toothpaste containing radium, and Radithor, radium-laced water that was advertised for supposed health properties. Radithor is the same product that ultimately led to the horrifying death of the famous golfer Eben Byers. One of these products, however, was Undark, a paint created in 1917 that contained radium plus a luminescent molecule, zinc sulfide to be exact, that would cause radioluminescence, the phenomenon of fluorescence as a result of radioactivity. This caused the paint to glow in the dark perpetually, and consequently, this had very foreseeable benefits at the time. For example, during World War I, soldiers needed to navigate in the dark without giving away their position, so some compasses were made using radium paint in World War I, like this Taylor Use-at-Night compass. Furthermore, people would be empowered to tell time in the dark if clocks could be painted with this substance. Pilots could read their gauges in the dark, so they could properly see without needing bright lights, allowing them to remain stealthy and covert. Ultimately, an industry-forming need was created that led to a new kind of job, one that needed delicate hands and a very fine brush. During World War I, women were hired by companies in the United States to carry out a very specific task: paint watch and clock dials, gauges, and compasses with radium paint. In fact, at the industry's peak around the beginning of the 1920s, about 2,000 women were hired. There were three main companies that began hiring young women to paint radium on clock dials in 1917: the United States Radium Corporation, the Radium Dial Company, and the Waterbury Clock Company. The three states where this kind of work was conducted were New Jersey, Illinois, and Connecticut. Well, aside from working with what was known both then and today to be radioactive material, what was the issue, other than the apparent lack of safety measures as seen in the photographs? The young women were instructed to do the unthinkable today. In order to paint such fine details onto the small, delicate parts of their products, they needed to use brushes with very fine points. Consequently, they were instructed by the companies to press the brush tip between their lips to draw the brush tip to a fine point. In fact, some of the women in these factories had fun by painting their teeth and parts of their bodies with the radioactive paint. Their dresses would be contaminated with glowing radium paint often after work, as well as their hair and other parts of their bodies like their skin. Contamination became so bad that well after their work days, some of them would glow during the night. Little did they know at that time they were effectively dosing themselves with ionizing radiation, slowly poisoning their bodies to death. This ultimately led to many of the workers deteriorating from the inside out. Their bones became so fragile that even the slightest amount of pressure would cause them to fracture. The first of many who suffered due to radium poisoning was Amelia Mejia, a worker for the United States Radium Corporation, which was, at the time, named the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation. What started as a toothache for her soon became the withering away of her entire jaw. Even after removing her jaw entirely, the radium had spread through her body. By then, it was too late. She died on September 12, 1922. Soon afterwards, many others experienced the same kind of symptoms, fell ill, and also died of their condition. Their condition, by the way, was similar to Evan Byers. Remember the golfer I mentioned earlier? He was the famous golfer who died due to, yes, radium poisoning, in a similar manner as these women. All of that is terrible, but why did this element cause so much destruction? And why is it so dangerous? To understand this, you need a bit of a crash course in the science behind why this affected them so badly. Atoms. Atoms are the individual pieces of matter that create our universe. There are particles smaller than them called subatomic particles, but that's besides the point. The atom is special because it is the smallest thing that can maintain an elemental identity. An element is a particular kind of atom that has a specific number of protons and has specific atomic properties. The proton is one of the three basic atomic particles that make up an atom, the other two being the neutron and the electron. Over time, scientists have discovered and compiled all the known elements in the universe into a table arranged by proton number and atomic properties, known as the periodic table of the elements. And this is the same table you often see in science textbooks or hanging in a classroom. However, the periodic table, although impressive, doesn't tend to show you how much variation there is regarding matter. This is where isotopes come in. An isotope is an atom of one kind of element with a different number of neutrons in the nucleus than what is most abundant. For example, carbon, the element on which life greatly depends, has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons most of the time. This isotope is therefore named carbon-12, because the isotope number, 12, is the sum of the protons and neutrons in the nuclei that make up most of the carbon in our universe. 6 plus 6 equals 12. However, this element has more than one isotope, and you've probably heard of the really popular one, carbon-14. Carbon-14, although it is less abundant than carbon-12, exists naturally and contains 2 more neutrons in its nucleus than carbon-12. But how does this relate to radioactivity? Well, when too many neutrons are present in a nucleus, the nucleus becomes unstable. Generally, things don't like to hold a lot of energy. When it is unstable, it tries to lose excess energy through, you guessed it, radioactive decay. Either the nucleus will eject a particle to get rid of excess energy, or it will release energy in the form of high-energy electromagnetic waves. Now, there are a few commonly encountered types of radiation. Alpha particles, which are nothing more than helium nuclei, or just a helium nucleus is one individual alpha particle. beta particles, which are basically just electrons, and gamma rays, the high-energy electromagnetic waves I mentioned earlier. All of them travel different distances, have different penetration abilities through material, and mean different things for the human body. So, back to the Radium Girls. Why was it so harmful? Radium-226, the isotope being used in the paint, is naturally an alpha emitter. This essentially just means that radium is kicking out alpha particles from its nucleus most of the time. Normally, alpha particles can't go further than the surface of your skin, so on the outside of your body, they're not seriously dangerous and can be cleaned up with relative ease. But on the inside of you, they wreak havoc on your internal organs and are considered, from a health physics perspective, the most dangerous form of internal contamination you can get, causing thousands and thousands of atomic-sized bullet holes in your cells and ripping apart your DNA. To give you some perspective, it would be just like launching a bowling ball at full force against a row of bowling pins, where, in this analogy, the pins are your DNA and the bowling ball is the radiation. But wait, there's more. Your body cannot tell the difference between radium and calcium, so it takes whatever radium is present and places some of it in your bones. Now you know why the Radium Girls suffered from easily fractured bones, bone cancer, and radium jaw. The radium they ingested went into their bones and was eating them from the inside out. Many fell ill, and by 1927, 50 women had died due to radium poisoning. Something needed to be done about this crisis, and fast. Like most company tragedies in America, the reason why it took so long to do anything is because of company greed. For the United States Radium Corporation, this could not have been any truer. Some of the most egregious practices were employed by Radium Corp to keep the tragedies a secret. Doctors were brought in to look at and diagnose those suffering from radium poisoning. But the doctors and dentists brought in were paid off by Radium Corp to misdiagnose those who were suffering. Furthermore, when voicing their concerns to their superiors, the women would be gaslit by their male superiors that nothing was wrong. Oftentimes, they were misdiagnosed with the STD, syphilis, which was even more damaging, not just to their actual health, but also their reputation, because a diagnosis of syphilis would have meant they slept around. Many who lived in towns where factory work was common would even blame the Radium Girls for job loss during the Great Depression. Radium Corp was sued in 1927 by 5 of the women who worked for them and contracted radium poisoning. Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta McDonald, and Albina Laris, the last 2 of them being sisters. This, however, was not the first time Radium Corp had been sued about radium poisoning, being sued earlier for the same thing in 1925 by Marguerite Carlo. Yet it was this specific 5-woman case that gained national attention. Despite this lawsuit, Radium Corp kept delaying the trial as much as possible, hoping that death would come for them before having to face justice. Even Curie herself would speak about the issue of radium poisoning regarding the case. She is quoted as saying the following: "I would be only too happy to give any aid that I could, but there's absolutely no means of destroying the substance once it enters the human body." This meant that, despite any medical treatments that could have been done, there was absolutely no hope of recovery. It was not until 1928 that the Radium Girls were able to go before court. Due to radium exposure, 2 women out of the 5 did not have enough strength to lift up their hands for swearing in at testimony. Another 2 who testified were bedridden. After yet again delaying the case, the Radium Corp decided to settle out of court with the women before a decision was made by the jury. The settlement was complete by fall of 1928. Each of the 5 women received $10,000, a $600 annuity per year while living, and all medical and legal expenses paid on behalf of the company. Tragically, the money was ultimately used to pay for their funerals soon after their case was settled. By the middle of the 1930s, all 5 of the women who fought for their lives had died. The 1927 case was not the only incident when lawsuits were filed about radium poisoning. According to the Library of Congress, workers at the Radium Dial Company in Illinois were reassured upon hearing the news of the radium workers from the 1927 case that the real cause was mesothorium in the New Jersey paint, and that the paint at Radium Dial Corporation was safe because it contained only radium, even though this was absolutely a lie. Again, dial painters fell ill and tried to sue the Radium Dial Company in 1935, but the statute of limitations hampered their legal processes. It was not until 1937 when the first hearing for the women working at the Ottawa plant was held in front of the Illinois Industrial Commission. The Library of Congress goes on to say about Catherine Donahue, one of the women in Illinois who sued for radium poisoning, quote, "In 1938, after more testimony before the Illinois Industrial Commission, including Donahue's from her sickbed after she collapsed at the hearing, the Ottawa dial painters won their case. The Radium Dial Company filed numerous appeals. Donahue survived long enough to know that the company's first appeal before the commission was unanimously denied. She died on July 27, 1938, the day after Radium Dial's attorneys filed their next appeal. On October 23, 1939, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear the company's final appeal, and the lower court ruling was upheld. The Ottawa dial painters had a measure of justice after Donahue's death." In the case of the Radium Girls, many of them did not have a happy ending. But what they did for America and ultimately the world by fighting for their rights made their legacy live even today. What good things came out of such tragedy? First, the Radium Girls were the direct result of hazardous workplace practices and was one of the influencing factors in why the government created OSHA. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration was not made until 1971, but the Radium Girls were one of the many reasons why its creation was necessary. Their fight ultimately led to creating a healthier, safer working-class, rights-oriented working space for all Americans. Second, the women's symptoms and deaths were verified proof of radium poisoning as a condition. If there was any doubt of radium poisoning before the events described here, there was wholeheartedly none now. Radium poisoning was not a medical condition until 1925, when it was proven by Dr. Harrison Martland. Because of this, the signs can now be recognized quickly if a dreaded case should ever occur again. Third, a direct example of health and safety for the public regarding radioactive materials was created because of the Radium Girls. Radioactivity is no joke. Despite the fact that being silly about the subject can be entertaining, it was much more proof that handling radioactive materials should come at great caution. Fourth, it provided concrete and solid evidence that radium is bad for human health. Remember the radium craze? If none of these events had happened, then who knows? Perhaps deaths due to ingestion and application of radium could have been more prolonged and the condition unrecognized by doctors for a much longer period of time. But finally, and most important of all, their story has inspired generations. Movies and books have been created to memorialize the bravery and spirit of these women, such courage and dedication in the faces of death and corruption of humanity, their fight to have their rights upheld, and their legacy as a result. These are what make the history so compelling, so challenging, and so awe-inspiring. There is a statue in Ottawa, Illinois, that commemorates the grit and metal spirit of these women. Every winter, as a gesture of goodwill, the people cover the statue to keep it shielded from the cold. It is beyond clear that the dedication of these women to justice still affects people today. In fact, it has even affected me. The ticking sound you heard at the beginning of this video, that is the real, genuine sound of my 1925 model Big Ben radium clock. Because of the age of this clock, the time period from which it came, it was definitely touched by these women. It is unknown who, but it is certain that it was painted by their hands. What you heard then and what you are hearing now is the sound through time of their legacy. A legacy of physical and mental pain, disfiguring agony, discrimination and workplace injustice, and most of all, triumph in the face of adversity. Like the ticking sound of this clock, their voices echo through time to tell their story.